I took my wife in for surgery to keep her alive. When we came back, I lost my own life. The taxi stopped in front of the lake house I had built with 30 years of work. But the white gate was gone. The familiar lock wasn't there. A stranger stood on my porch and said calmly, "You're trespassing on private property." I looked down at Martha in her wheelchair. She whispered, "Did we come to the wrong house?" I didn't answer, because in that moment, I understood. Something had been broken forever. Before I go on, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this. And if you're listening at home in your car or late at night, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Now, let me tell you what happened right after that question. I didn't answer Martha's question. I just opened the car door, walked around to the back, placed my hands on the wheelchair, and eased her down. The driveway in front of the house sloped slightly. Years ago, I had poured bag after bag of small gravel there so Martha could wheel herself into the garden every morning. Now the gravel was gone. In its place was a smooth sheet of concrete, flat cold like a statement that didn't need words. This place was no longer meant for us. Martha lifted her head and looked around. Her eyes moved across windows with unfamiliar curtains, spaces where her flower pots used to be. I saw her hands tighten around the armrests of the chair. She didn't say anything. She understood. We had lived together long enough not to need explanations in moments like that. I stepped onto the porch. The feeling under my feet was wrong. The old wooden boards that used to creak in familiar ways were gone, replaced by something new. I knocked on the door. Not the polite knock of a visitor, but the knock of a man coming home after a long trip. The door opened. A man I had never seen stood in front of me. He looked me up and down his eyes, stopping at the wheelchair behind me. "What do you want?" he asked. "I'm home," I said. My voice was low, steady. He gave a small smile like he'd heard this story before. "This house doesn't belong to you anymore. It's our company office now." I didn't argue. I looked past him. The living room where I used to read the paper every morning had been rearranged. Clean, polished, lifeless. No family photos on the walls. The wooden clock I had repaired again and again over the years was gone. Everything was spotless and completely empty. I turned back to Martha. She looked at me calm in a way that surprised me. She had spent 8 weeks in a recovery room in Singapore, surrounded by medicine, smells, white lights, and long stretches of silence. Compared to that, this was just another kind of quiet. I took out my phone and called Tyler. The ringing went on. He picked up on the third ring. "Dad, you're back," he said, no surprise in his voice. "Where are you?" I asked. "I'm on my way. Just wait there." 20 minutes later, Tyler arrived. He stepped out of a car I knew was worth far more than anything he had ever owned. His shirt was crisp, his face tense, but not confused. He glanced briefly at his mother, then turned to me. "I didn't have a choice," he said, like he'd practiced the line many times. He handed me a stack of papers. I took them. Numbers, stamps, familiar words that suddenly felt distant. He spoke quickly. About overseas medical costs going beyond expectations, about things getting out of control, about doing what he had to do to protect the family. I listened, not because I believed him, but because I wanted to see how far he would go. "I sold the house," he said, at last meeting my eyes, "to take care of Mom." I looked at Martha. She lowered her head. I knew what she was doing, trying to recall every bill, every insurance confirmation email we had reviewed together in Singapore. We knew the numbers. We knew exactly where we stood. We were never on the edge, the way Tyler was describing. The stranger leaned against the door, growing impatient. "If you don't leave, I'll call security," he said. Tyler nodded, almost in agreement. "Mom and Dad should go. We'll talk about this later." Later, such a light word. But I understood. For Tyler, later meant everything was already closed. I turned the wheelchair around and pushed Martha away. When the wheels reached the edge of the road, she gently took my hand. "Sam," she whispered. "I'm sorry." I shook my head. "This isn't your fault." We left without looking back. In the taxi's rearview mirror, the lake house grew smaller, like a memory being pulled out of me. I didn't feel angry. Not yet. I felt a familiar coldness instead. The same feeling I used to have before every major investigation, when the surface has been wiped clean, and the truth is just beginning to show. That night, in a temporary room near the hospital, I sat by the window and looked down at an unfamiliar street. Martha was asleep, her breathing slow and even. I opened the folder Tyler had given me and laid each page out on the table. Some details didn't match. Some gaps were far too quiet. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. The trip to Singapore wasn't over. It had only opened the door to another journey. This time, I wasn't going to save anyone. This time, I was going to uncover what had been hidden inside my own family. The next morning, I let Martha sleep in. Her body needed longer stretches of quiet now. I put on my jacket, took the folder of documents, and walked to the bank we had been with for more than 20 years. Along the way, I thought about the moment at the Singapore airport when I rushed through a stack of papers so I could get Martha onto the connecting flight. All I cared about was keeping her from hurting anymore. I never stopped to think about what those rushed signatures might cost us. Inside the bank, everything looked the same, neat, orderly. The teller who knew me glanced up. Her smile faded when she saw my face. I handed over my card and said my name. She typed longer than usual, then looked up. "There's no available balance in your account," she said carefully. I asked for a statement. The numbers appeared clean and orderly, almost too perfect, like they had been carefully wiped down. The transfers were made while we were in Singapore, all with valid electronic signatures. Authorized party Tyler Miller. I asked about the legal basis. She handed me a copy of the authorization form. My handwriting was there, familiar. But the scope was different. An emergency medical authorization had been expanded into full financial control. No warning, no confirmation call, just a silent sequence of approvals. When I left the bank, I sat down on the cold stone steps and let the chill seep through my coat. I didn't feel angry. I felt empty. It was the same feeling I'd had before. Standing in front of files that looked flawless on the surface while something invisible inside was clearly broken. Around noon, I stopped by the county property records office. I didn't say much. I asked for the transaction history of the lake house. The clerk handed me a thin folder, neatly organized. The buyer was a company with a generic name registered in Delaware. The seller was me. My signature appeared again. Same stroke, same slant, but at the wrong time. I requested a copy of the contract. Some clauses were written carefully enough for a non-expert to overlook. The signing date matched the day Martha went into surgery. The buyer's contact address led to a shared office rented by the hour. The preparer of the documents, Jessica. The name sat on the page, calm and cold. I returned to the rental room after dark. Martha was sitting by the window, the sunset resting softly on her face. She asked where I had been. I told her I'd stopped by a few places. I didn't say everything. I wanted her to eat first. When I opened the cabinet, I noticed the medicine box Martha brought back from Singapore had been moved. The lid was open. Several blister packs were missing. I asked her about it. She looked down at her hands. Tyler said, "We don't need those anymore," she said. He said the doctors here would prescribe new ones. I said nothing. I called Tyler. He didn't answer. That night, Martha was in more pain. I sat beside the bed, listening to her breathing grow heavier. I remembered the look in the doctor's eyes in Singapore when he told me to follow the treatment plan exactly. I thought about the missing medication, thrown away like something outdated, a decision made for us without asking. The next morning I went back to the lake house. I didn't go inside. I stood across the street, watching strangers move in and out, managing a place that now held no memories for them. I called an old friend from the field and asked him to look into the company that bought the house. The answer came faster than I expected. It was a shell company. No real operations used to collect and rotate assets. That afternoon, I met Jessica at a cafe downtown. She arrived on time, well-dressed, a polite, measured smile. She talked about family, about pressure, about hard decisions. I let her talk. I asked a few light questions. About process, about paperwork. Her answers flowed smoothly. When I asked about the signing date, she paused. Just for a moment. But for me, that was enough. That evening, when I returned to the room, Martha was sitting on the bed, holding a small box. Inside was my old wooden clock. She had found it in a box left behind in the storage shed. One Tyler hadn't cleared out yet. "I didn't want it thrown away," she said. I held the clock, feeling the familiar scratch along its edge. And that was when I understood, clearly. This was no longer about money. Someone had decided they had the right to choose what stayed and what was erased from our lives. Night fell. I sat at the table, arranging documents and timelines one by one. Things began to connect without hurry. The silences between transactions, the signatures appearing when we couldn't respond. A structure built carefully enough to look legal from the outside, and cold enough to leave no room for family. I looked over at Martha. She was asleep now, her face a little more peaceful. I knew I couldn't go back to being a father who waited for explanations. Some doors had been closed, and when that happens, the only thing left is to open the truth layer by layer until there's nothing left to hide. I didn't sleep much that night, not because of anger, but because my mind had slipped back into its old rhythm. When scattered pieces start to fit, emotion becomes a liability. I needed order, I needed time, and I needed evidence placed exactly where it belonged. Early that morning, I went back to the storage room behind the lake house. Tyler had overlooked it, thinking it held no value. The space was low, damp, familiar, a weak ceiling light. Inside, I found boxes from my years as an inspector. Old notebooks, backup drives, a camera with a chipped casing. Nothing new, but enough to begin. I didn't break in. I didn't confront anyone. I observed. From across the road, I watched the routine of the office inside my former home. People came and went, but no one stayed long. They arrived, signed a few things, and left. Different cars, different faces, the same pattern. I logged times, license plates, order of appearance. An old method, slow, unnoticeable. At midday, I met my friend from finance again. He helped me trace transfers from our accounts into intermediary ones, then back to a small circle of investors. The money was broken up, spread thin, kept clean. Too clean. Clean systems leave trails. I marked the days Tyler met his partners against the dates of large withdrawals. The overlap repeated itself. No long explanation needed. That afternoon, a copy of a life insurance contract landed in an old family email address. The policyholder was Tyler. The beneficiary, Jessica. The signing date fell in the week before our trip to Singapore. I read every clause carefully. Nothing crossed a legal line. But the structure did. Everything was arranged for a worst-case outcome. Not for protection, but for profit, if something went wrong. I closed the laptop and took a long breath. I didn't need to name it. I only needed to know what I was standing in front of. That evening, Tyler called me. His voice was lower than before. He said he wanted to clear things up. I agreed. I chose a public place. Bright. Open. I didn't record the conversation. I listened. He talked about pressure, about money that had to keep moving, about people waiting for answers. I asked a few simple questions. Dates? Amounts? He answered quickly, but avoided certain points. I didn't push. I let him finish. Afterward, I wrote everything down while it was still fresh. Not his words, but the silences between them. Those can't be edited. Over the next few days, I worked on a fixed schedule. Mornings took Martha to follow-up appointments. Afternoons handled paperwork. Evenings built timelines. Martha was weaker but clear-minded. She didn't ask what I was doing. She only placed her hand over mine whenever I stood up, reminding me to slow down. I did. One rainy afternoon, an email arrived. An invitation to an investor gathering at the lake house. From Tyler. The wording was polite, professional. I read it twice. Once to understand, once to be sure. They wanted to display stability, to show everything had settled into place. And that is when things are most exposed. I didn't reply right away. I sent my materials to a lawyer who specializes in financial fraud, someone I had worked with before. He read them, asked a few short questions, then said, "If you step in at the right moment, the truth will speak for itself." The night before the meeting, I opened the wooden clock. Inside, the gears moved steadily, despite the scars on the outside. I set it on the table next to the stack of numbered documents. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for order, the order that had been quietly taken from my family. The next morning, I put on my old coat, not to impress anyone, but to remind myself how the work is done. I didn't go alone. I went with people who understand records, law, and timing. No confrontation, no raised voices, just documents placed on the table when the moment arrived. As we approached the lake house, I looked at Martha through the car window. She gave a small nod. I understood. Some chapters have to be opened in public, so they can be closed the right way. And I knew that once the doors to that meeting opened, everything built in silence would begin to collapse on its own. No force, no arguments, just the truth, placed where it belongs in the light. That evening, the lake house was lit up more brightly than I had seen in years. Light poured from the tall windows, reflecting off the still water, creating a false sense of calm. I arrived before the scheduled time and stood across the street watching cars pull in one by one. Well-dressed faces stepped inside, carrying trust and expectation. I had seen this scene before. Gatherings like this are where people are most willing to believe. I didn't rush. I waited until the laughter inside settled, until glasses were raised and promises had begun. Then I crossed the street. The door opened. Tyler stood in the middle of the living room talking about long-term vision and rare opportunity. He stopped when he saw me, just a brief second, but enough for me to catch the shift in his eyes. Jessica stood beside him, her smile unchanged, as if everything were still on schedule. I didn't speak. I walked in slowly, letting every head turn on its own. Some recognized me. Some didn't. I didn't need them to know who I was. I only needed them to listen. I set my briefcase on the large table at the center of the room. The dull sound echoed, and the room went quiet. Tyler forced a smile. He said I'd come at the wrong time. I nodded. Yes, I said, but it's the right moment. I opened the case. Not everything. Just the first few sets of documents. I spoke about the trip to Singapore, about the time we were away, about signatures that appeared when we couldn't be present. I didn't use heavy words. I read timelines, dates, times, figures, everything in order. Jessica stepped in, saying all transactions were legal. I agreed with her. Legal on paper, I said, but paper doesn't tell the whole story. I placed the medical insurance confirmation from Singapore on the table, showing the treatment had been fully covered. I set it beside the house sale contract. 2 stacks of paper, side by side. No explanation needed. Silence spread quickly. A few people began to look at one another. Tyler moved closer, lowering his voice, saying I was ruining everything. I looked at him. For the first time that evening, I met my son's eyes. No, I said. Everything was already ruined before I walked into this room. The back door opened. The people who came with me stepped inside and showed their credentials. No raised voices. No one touched anyone. Just a presence clear enough for the room to understand this was no longer a business pitch. The investors started asking questions. Ordinary questions. But the answers no longer came smoothly. Tyler looked at Jessica. Jessica looked down at her folder. The early confidence fractured into gaps. I laid out the transaction map, arrows moving from one account to another, then looping back to the same point. I didn't name it. I let others do that themselves. When truth is shown that way, it doesn't need commentary. Someone stood up, set their glass down, and asked to leave. Others stayed, wanting to understand what they had stepped into. I remained still. My voice stayed even. I didn't feel victory. I felt a familiar weight lifting from my chest. At the end of the evening, Tyler tried once more. He asked if I could stop. I shook my head. It's not my decision, I said. I'm only showing what already happened. Jessica stayed silent. For the first time, she had no prepared answer. When they were asked to step outside for separate discussions, the room was nearly empty. The lights were still on, but the laughter was gone. I gathered the papers and placed them back in the case. I stepped onto the porch where wind rose off the lake, carrying the cold scent of water. I stood there for a moment, looking back inside. The house was still the same house, but it no longer had the right to hold me. When I turned away, no one called out, maybe because there was nothing left to say. I walked slowly down the steps, each one like a period at the end of a long sentence. That night, I didn't go straight back to the rental room. I drove along the water, letting my thoughts settle. I knew that after the light of this evening would come long days of paperwork, questions, and consequences. But I also knew the hardest moment had already passed, not when strangers claimed my home, but when I chose to walk into that room with the truth and let it do the work on its own. The days after that evening moved more slowly than I expected. There was no noise, no chaos, just one appointment after another, questions asked in neutral voices and folders growing thicker page by page. I participated just enough. I answered when asked. The rest I let the system do what it does. My part was finished the moment I placed those papers on the table that night. Tyler and Jessica stopped contacting me. That didn't surprise me. Some relationships don't end with a conversation. They end with a long, deliberate silence. I didn't try to break that silence. I accepted it as something inevitable. Martha recovered slowly but steadily. In the mornings, she sat by the window, sipping tea, watching people pass by. The pain didn't disappear overnight, but it no longer came in waves. I learned to be patient alongside her. We didn't talk much about what had happened, not because we were avoiding it, but because we both understood there are things you move through, not revisit. When all matters related to the lake house were settled, I went back one last time, not to stay, but to close the door properly. I walked through each room without rushing. Bare walls, corners renovated in a way that felt hollow. I wasn't looking for memories. I was only making sure there was nothing from the present left behind. I decided to sell the house. The decision came naturally without debate. That place had completed its role in my life. Holding on would only add weight. I didn't use the money to buy something bigger. A portion went to make sure Martha's treatment would never be interrupted. With the rest, I created a small fund. I called it the Guardian Heart. Not to leave a mark, but as a reminder. The fund provides legal support for older people, pushed aside by those they once trusted. I'm not the face of it. I stay in the background, making sure everything runs clean and transparent. That work gives me a familiar feeling. Not joy, but alignment. Each case handled properly is a burden set down. I don't see it as redemption or compensation. I see it as responsibility, one I can still carry while my mind is clear. A few months later, Martha and I moved to a quiet coastal town. A small apartment, a narrow balcony, plenty of light. In the mornings, we hear the ocean in the distance. In the evenings, I read the paper while Martha tends to a few small plants. Nothing special, and that is exactly why it feels light. One afternoon on the balcony, Martha asked if I had any regrets. I thought for a long time before answering. I don't regret telling the truth. I only regret not realizing sooner that silence can hurt too. I no longer follow what happens behind the closed doors of those people. I don't need every detail of the outcome. What matters is knowing I didn't turn away from the truth, and I didn't let fear do the choosing for me. One evening, I brought the wooden clock out to the balcony. I opened it and listened to the steady movement of the gears. I placed it beside Martha's hand. She rested her hand on mine, no words. We looked out at the sea, where the horizon has no clear edge. I thought about Singapore, about the white room where the doctor told me there was still a chance. Back then, I trusted science to save a life. Now, I trust clarity to save what remains of my own. Family is not something we choose, but how we live with what happens. That is, I didn't bring bitterness with me to this place. I brought a simple lesson. Don't excuse what's wrong in the name of love. Justice isn't about punishing someone. It's about freeing those who still want to move forward without lowering their heads. As the sun set, Martha leaned against my shoulder. I held her hand, feeling the warmth still there. Everything behind us was closed. Not perfectly, not neatly, but quiet enough for us to begin another chapter, smaller, slower, and more honest. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you for listening with patience and respect. If this story made you think or reminded you of something real in your own life, please subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone you care about. Each share might help someone realize they are not alone. This story isn't about money. It's about the line between family and integrity. Blood is what we're born with. Kindness and honesty are choices we make every day. Don't stay silent in the face of what's wrong just because you're afraid of losing a relationship. Sometimes telling the truth isn't about hurting someone else. It's about saving yourself. Thank you for staying until the very last moment. I'll see you again in the next story.